In the annals of human history, there are moments that test the very boundaries of what we consider civilized behavior. Stories that force us to confront the darkest capabilities of the human spirit when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Today, we examine one such moment from over 12 centuries ago, a siege that would become synonymous with desperation so complete that an entire population simply vanished into the stomachs of those sworn to protect them. This is not a tale for the faint of heart. What transpired in the Chinese city of Suiyang during the winter and spring of 757 CE represents one of the most horrifying examples of survival cannibalism in recorded history. But to understand how an entire urban population could be consumed by its own defenders, we must first journey back to the golden age that preceded this nightmare. The Tang dynasty of ancient China stood as one of history's most magnificent civilizations. For over a century, it had presided over an era of unprecedented cultural flowering, military might, and economic prosperity. Poetry reached heights that are still celebrated today. Trade routes stretched across continents, bringing wealth beyond imagination. The capital city of Chang'an housed over 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest city on Earth at the time. Yet beneath this golden surface, cracks were beginning to show grown too large. The empire has too complex, too dependent on military strongmen to maintain order across its vast territories. By the middle of the 8th century, these tensions would explode into a rebellion so devastating that it would consume nearly 2/3 of China's population and ultimately doom the dynasty that had created such splendor. The architect of this catastrophe was An Lushan, a general whose ambitions matched his considerable military talents. In December of 755, this man, who had once sworn loyalty to the Tang emperor, declared himself ruler of a rival dynasty. His rebellion would rage for 8 years, transforming the Middle Kingdom into a charnel house where brother fought brother and entire cities were reduced to ash and bone. But our story focuses on one particular defender who stood against this tide of destruction. Zhang Xun was not born to greatness. He came from modest origins, working his way up through the military ranks through competence rather than connections. When the rebellion erupted, he found himself stationed in a small county, serving under a commanding officer who quickly decided that joining the rebels offered better prospects than remaining loyal to a seemingly doomed dynasty. Zhang Xun disagreed. In what would prove to be the first of many acts of almost supernatural determination, he gathered his fellow soldiers at a temple dedicated to Laozi, the founder of Taoism. There, surrounded by incense and ancient wisdom, he delivered a speech that would change the course of the war. His words were so powerful, so filled with conviction about duty and honor, that grown warriors wept openly. By the time he finished speaking, every man present had sworn to fight for the Tang dynasty until death. This moment of inspiration would prove prophetic in ways none of them could have imagined. With his small band of loyalists, Zhang Xun marched to the fortress city of Yongqiu, where he would make his first stand against impossible odds. When the rebel army arrived with 15,000 soldiers to face his mere 1,000 defenders, conventional wisdom suggested immediate surrender. Instead, Zhang Xun achieved what military historians still struggle to explain. Through superior tactics, unshakable morale, and perhaps divine favor, his tiny force not only held the walls, but inflicted such devastating casualties that the rebels retreated in disarray. The victory should have been celebrated throughout the empire. Instead, it marked Zhang Xun as a particular enemy of the rebellion. When An Lushan's forces returned the following month with 40,000 troops, they came with explicit orders to make an example of the man who had dared to resist them. Once again, Zhang Xun's forces had grown, but only to 3,000 men. Once again, the mathematics of warfare suggested certain defeat. What followed was a masterclass in defensive warfare that would be studied for centuries to come. As rebel ladders struck the fortress walls, Tang soldiers set them ablaze with their occupants still climbing. Wave after wave of attacks crashed against the defenders, like ocean swells against an immovable cliff. the rebels began offering bribes to their own soldiers just to convince them to attempt the walls. So fearsome had Zhang Shun's reputation become. Frustrated by their inability to take the fortress by storm, the rebel commanders resorted to siege warfare. They surrounded Yongqiu completely, cutting off all supplies and communications with the outside world. This was meant to be the beginning of the end for Zhang Shun and his stubborn defenders. Instead, it became the stage for one of military history's most brilliant deceptions. Night after night, the sound of war drums echoed from within the fortress walls. The rebel general, convinced that each drumbeat heralded a desperate night attack, kept his entire army on high alert. Soldiers slept in their armor, weapons always within reach, nerves stretched taut as bowstrings. This continued for weeks until exhaustion began to take its toll on the besiegers. Zhang Shun waited patiently until he was certain the rebels had grown complacent with the nightly drum routine. Then, when they least expected it, he struck. But his target was not the rebel army itself, it was their commander. The problem was that Zhang Shun had no idea what the enemy general looked like among the thousands of soldiers surrounding his fortress. His solution was as brilliant as it was audacious. He ordered his archers to begin shooting bundles of grass at the rebel positions instead of arrows. The enemy soldiers, initially terrified by what they thought were incoming projectiles, soon began laughing when they realized they were being pelted with vegetation. Word quickly spread that the Tang forces had run out of ammunition, and messengers rushed to inform their general of this seemingly decisive development. Zhang Shun watched carefully as these messengers moved through the rebel camp, tracking their path until he could identify their destination. The moment he spotted the rebel commander, he gave the signal for his real archers to unleash a devastating barrage of actual arrows. One found its mark, striking the general directly in the eye and sending the entire rebel army into panicked retreat. The siege of Yongqiu was broken, but at a terrible cost to An Lushan's forces. Over 20,000 rebels lay dead around the fortress walls, their bodies a testament to the price of underestimating Zhang Shun's determination. The victory sent shockwaves throughout the rebellion and provided a desperately needed morale boost for Tang loyalists across the empire. Yet even as Zhang Shun was achieving the impossible at Yongqiu, the larger war was turning against the dynasty. Rebel forces continued to capture territory, recruit new soldiers, and push ever deeper into the heart of China. By 756, An Lushan commanded an army of over 130,000 men, and his attention had turned to a prize that would determine the fate of the entire empire. The city of Suyang stood as the key to southern China. If it fell, the rebels would have an open path to the empire's wealthiest and most populous regions. The Tang dynasty would be finished, and An Lushan would rule over all of China. Recognizing both the strategic importance of the city and Zhang Shun's proven abilities as a defender, the local governor requested that this hero of Yongqiu bring his forces to help defend Suyang against the coming storm. Zhang Shun accepted, perhaps not fully understanding that he was marching toward a siege that would test the absolute limits of human endurance and moral boundaries. As Zhang Shun arrived in Suyang with his battle-hardened veterans, he found a city preparing for the apocalypse. The governor had spent an entire year stockpiling grain, dried meats, preserved vegetables, and every conceivable supply that might sustain a prolonged siege. Warehouses overflowed with provisions that should have lasted months, even with the swollen population of defenders and civilians seeking refuge behind the city's walls. But bureaucracy has a way of destroying even the best laid plans. A district governor, drunk on his own authority and blind to the strategic reality unfolding before him, issued an order that would doom thousands of innocent souls. He commanded that Suyang's carefully hoarded supplies be distributed among all the fortresses in his district, spreading the city's lifeline thin across dozens of smaller outposts. It was administrative efficiency at its most lethal, a decision made by men who would never feel its consequences. Zhang Xun watched helplessly as cartload after cartload of precious food disappeared through the city gates, carried off to feed garrisons that would likely surrender at the first sight of rebel banners. The governor of Suyang protested violently, but orders were orders, and by the time the last wagon vanished into the distance, their survival margin had shrunk from comfortable to desperately precarious. In January of 757, the horizon darkened with dust clouds that stretched from east to west. The rebel army approaching Suyang was unlike anything the defenders had ever witnessed. 130,000 soldiers marched in perfect formation, their weapons glinting like scales on some monstrous serpent. Siege engines rolled behind them, massive catapults and battering rams that could reduce stone walls to rubble. This was not merely an army. It was a force of nature bent on conquest. Against this overwhelming tide stood fewer than 7,000 Tang loyalists. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. For every defender on the walls, 19 rebels waited below. In any conventional battle, such odds would guarantee swift and total defeat. But Zhang Xun had already proven that conventional wisdom meant nothing when faced with absolute determination. The siege began with the systematic encirclement of Suyang. Rebel forces spread out like floodwaters, sealing every gate, every path, every possible avenue of escape or resupply. The city became an island surrounded by an ocean of enemies, its population trapped with whatever resources remained after that fateful redistribution of supplies. The first attacks came with the dawn, waves of soldiers carrying ladders and ropes, determined to scale the walls through sheer numbers. The defenders met them with arrows, boiling oil, and stones hurled from the battlements. Bodies piled against the base of the walls like grim sculptures, yet still the rebels came. Each assault was beaten back, but at a cost that Zhang Xun's small force could ill afford. Days turned to weeks as the siege settled into a rhythm of violence and desperation. The rebels would attack, the defenders would repel them, and both sides would count their dead before preparing for the next assault. But while An Lushan could replace his losses with fresh recruits from the countryside, every Tang soldier who fell was irreplaceable. By spring, the first signs of real hunger began to appear. The daily rice rations grew smaller and smaller until each soldier received barely enough to sustain life. Desperate foraging parties scoured every corner of the city, gathering anything remotely edible. Dogs and cats vanished from the streets. Rats became precious commodities. Even grass and tree bark found their way into cooking pots as the defenders tried to fill their shrinking stomachs with whatever they could find. The psychological toll was even worse than the physical hunger. Soldiers who had once laughed and joked together now eyed each other's rations with undisguised envy. Civilians who had welcomed the Tang defenders now viewed them as competitors for the dwindling food supply. Trust, that most essential ingredient of military morale, began to corrode under the pressure of starvation. Yet somehow, impossibly, the walls held. Every rebel assault met the same fierce resistance, the same determination to die rather than surrender. Zhang Xun moved among his men like a force of nature, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest, his presence alone worth a dozen reinforcements. His voice could be heard above the clash of steel and the screams of the dying, constantly encouraging, constantly inspiring, constantly reminding his soldiers that they fought not just for themselves but for the future of their civilization. The rebel commanders grew increasingly frustrated with their inability to crack this stubborn nut. They had taken cities with far stronger walls and larger garrisons, yet this collection of starving defenders continued to defy them. Some began to whisper that Zhang Xun possessed supernatural powers, that he had made a bargain with dark spirits to sustain his resistance. In reality, what sustained Zhang Xun was something far more human but equally powerful, an absolute refusal to compromise his principles, no matter the cost. He had sworn an oath to defend the Tang dynasty, and that oath would bind him even unto death. His soldiers drew strength from this unwavering commitment, finding in their commander's example the the courage to continue fighting even as their bodies began to fail. By summer, the situation had become truly desperate. The Tang garrison had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 effective soldiers, many of them so weak from hunger that they could barely lift their weapons. The civilian population had largely consumed everything remotely edible within the city walls. Children cried constantly from hunger pangs, while their parents searched frantically for anything that might quiet their suffering. It was then that Zhang Shun made a decision that would haunt military historians for centuries to come. Recognizing that his force would soon be too weak to defend the walls effectively, he selected 30 of his finest remaining soldiers for a desperate mission. Led by his most trusted lieutenant, Captain Nan Jiyun, these men would attempt to break through the rebel siege lines and reach the outside world, carrying urgent pleas for reinforcement and supplies. The breakout succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. Against overwhelming odds, Nan Jiyun and his soldiers carved through the rebel positions like a sword through silk, leaving only 3 of their number behind as they disappeared into the countryside. For the first time in months, there was hope that help might be coming, but that hope would prove to be crueler than despair itself. Town after town, city after city, Nan Jiyun and his surviving soldiers carried their desperate message across the countryside. At each stop, they begged local governors for troops, for supplies, for any assistance that might save the dying garrison at Suyang. The responses they received painted a picture of an empire in collapse, where self-preservation had replaced loyalty and cowardice masqueraded as prudence. The most crushing rejection came from the governor of Linhuai, a man whose jealousy toward Zhang Shun had festered for an infect-years-like wound. Here was a petty official who had spent his career resenting the recognition that Zhang Shun received for his military prowess. And now he saw an opportunity for petty revenge, disguised as political calculation. When Nan Jiyun arrived, exhausted and starving, the governor welcomed him with a feast that would have fed a dozen men. But Nan Jiyun, thinking of his comrades slowly dying of hunger behind Suyang's walls, refused to take even a single bite. The contrast was obscene. This abundance spread before him while his brothers in arms gnawed on leather and bark. In a gesture that would become legendary for its demonstration of loyalty and sacrifice, Nan Jiyun drew his dagger and severed his own finger, leaving it on the governor's table as proof that he had been there, that he had tried, and that some men still understood the meaning of honor. The governor watched in shock as this skeletal warrior turned and walked away from his feast, choosing starvation over betrayal of his starving comrades. It was a moment that crystallized everything wrong with the empire, the way corruption and self-interest had replaced the virtues that once made China not great. Every leader had forgotten their duty. One governor, moved by Nan Jiyun's sacrifice and the desperate situation at Suyang, assembled 3,000 soldiers to march to the city's relief. It was far fewer than what was needed, but it represented hope in its purest form. These men knew they were marching toward almost certain death, yet they went anyway because some causes transcend self-preservation. The return journey to Suyang became a nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The rebel forces, now fully aware of the breakout and expecting a relief effort, had reinforced their siege lines with deadly efficiency follow. What was not a battle but a slaughter. Wave after wave of Tang reinforcements crashed against the rebel positions like ocean waves against jagged rocks. Of the 3,000 soldiers who are Suyang, only one marched to save to fight 1,000 managed their way through the encircling rebel army. 2,000 brave men died within sight of the city they had come to rescue, their bodies adding to the mountain of corpses that surrounded Suyang's walls. For those watching from the battlements, the sight was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Help had come, but at such a terrible cost that it felt more like a curse than a blessing. The arrival of reinforcements should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it marked the beginning of Suyang's final descent into an abyss from which there could be no return. 1,000 additional soldiers meant 1,000 additional mouths to feed in a city where food had already become more precious than gold. The mathematics of survival, already impossibly skewed, now tipped beyond any hope of balance. By late summer, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything the defenders could have imagined in their darkest nightmares. Every rat had been caught and eaten. Every blade of grass had been stripped and boiled into thin gruel. The leather from armor and saddles had been softened with water and consumed like meat. Even the glue that held buildings together had been scraped away and mixed into desperate soups that provided more psychological comfort than actual nutrition. The civilian population, swollen by refugees who had fled to Suiyang seeking safety, now found themselves trapped in a death trap of their own making. Children who had arrived healthy and laughing now lay listless in their mother's arms, too weak to cry. The elderly simply disappeared one by one, their bodies too frail to survive on the microscopic rations that were all the city could provide. It was during these darkest days that the unthinkable began to seem inevitable. Whispered conversations took place in shadowed corners, discussing options that civilized people should never have to consider. The recently dead, soldiers who had fallen defending the walls, and civilians who had succumbed to starvation began to be viewed not as fallen comrades, but as potential sustenance. The first instances of cannibalism occurred quietly, almost shamefully. Bodies were spirited away under cover of darkness, processed in hidden cellars, and consumed by families who had watched their children waste away to living skeletons. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew what was happening. The taboo that had held human civilization together for millennia crumbled under the weight of absolute desperation. Zhang Shun watched this degradation of his people with growing horror, but he also understood the terrible arithmetic of survival. His soldiers needed strength to continue defending the walls. The civilians needed hope to avoid complete panic. Something had to be done to maintain order and discipline, even as the foundations of human decency cracked beneath their feet. The moment that would define Zhang Shun's legacy forever came on a night when despair hung over the city like a suffocating blanket. Gathering his remaining soldiers around him, he praised their loyalty and courage in terms that brought tears to eyes that had seen too much death. These men had given everything for their cause, he told them, and now it was time for him to give something in return. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. Zhang Shun's beloved concubine stood beside him, a woman who had shared his bed and his hopes for a future that now seemed impossible. In full view of his assembled soldiers, Zhang Shun drew his sword and killed her with a single stroke. Her blood pooled on the ground like spilled wine, dark and terrible in the flickering torchlight. The soldiers recoiled in horror, many weeping openly at this demonstration of sacrifice that went beyond anything they had imagined possible. But Zhang Shun's orders were clear and absolute. His cooks were summoned, and the unthinkable became reality. The woman who had loved and supported him became a meal shared among his starving defenders. This act of supreme sacrifice opened floodgates that could never be closed again. If their beloved commander could make such a sacrifice, then surely they could do whatever was necessary to continue their defense. The systematic consumption of Suiyang's population began in earnest, starting with those who had already died and progressing to those who were selected for sacrifice. Women disappeared from the streets first, rounded up by soldiers who had once sworn to protect them. The elderly vanished next, their frail bodies offering little resistance to men who had been transformed by starvation into something barely recognizable as human. Children were spared longest, but even they could not escape the inexorable logic of survival cannibalism. The governor of Suiyang, recognizing that leadership demanded the ultimate sacrifice, surrendered his own servants to feed the garrison. Wealthy merchants who had hoarded private food supplies found themselves and their families added to the communal larder. Class distinctions that had defined Chinese society for millennia dissolved in the face of this most fundamental need for survival. Through September and into October, this grotesque routine continued. The rebels, unaware of the horror unfolding within the city walls, maintained their siege with mechanical precision. They could see that resistance was weakening, that fewer arrows flew from the battlements with each passing day, but they attributed this to conventional starvation rather than the systematic consumption of an entire urban population. Zhang Shun's soldiers, their bellies temporarily filled with human flesh, continued to repel each rebel assault with the same desperate fury that had characterized their defense from the beginning. But their numbers were dwindling faster now, not just from combat casualties, but from the psychological toll of what they were doing to survive. Some men simply walked away from their posts and disappeared into the city's depths, unable to continue living with what they had become. The final assault came as autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson. The rebel commanders, sensing that Suyang's resistance was finally cracking, committed their reserves to one overwhelming attack that would settle the siege once and for all. Ladders rose against every section of wall simultaneously. Battering rams thundered against the gates with rhythmic precision. The air filled with arrows and screams as 30,000 rebels surged forward like a human tsunami. For 10 months, Zhang Shun had performed military miracles that defied every law of warfare. He had held impossible positions, defeated overwhelming odds, and inspired loyalty that transcended reason itself. But miracles, even the most profound ones, eventually reached their limits. When the rebels finally breached Suyang's walls, fewer than 400 Tang soldiers remained alive to oppose them. The sight that greeted the victorious rebels as they poured through the broken gates would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Suyang had become a city of the dead, but not in any way they could have anticipated. Piles of human bones lay scattered throughout the streets, picked clean and gleaming white in the afternoon sun. The stench of death and decay hung over everything like a physical presence. When Zhang Shun, Nan Jiyun, and the surviving defenders were finally captured, the rebel general, who had spent 10 months trying to break their resistance, found himself face to face with men who had transcended the boundaries of human experience. These skeletal figures, their teeth cracked from gnawing bones, their eyes hollow from witnessing unspeakable horrors, represented something beyond ordinary courage or determination. The rebel commander, perhaps seeking to understand what had driven these men to such extremes, forced open Zhang Shun's mouth with his dagger. What he found there told the entire story of Suyang's siege. Only 3 teeth remained unbroken, testament to months of consuming whatever could be found to sustain life. When asked why he had fought with such ferocity that his very teeth had shattered, Zhang Shun's response was simple and terrible. He wanted to use those broken teeth to devour every traitor who had betrayed the dynasty he had sworn to serve. The execution of Zhang Shun and his surviving defenders marked the end of one of military history's most horrifying sieges. In 10 months of resistance, they had reduced Suyang's population by as many as 30,000 people, transforming a thriving city into a charnel house where the living fed upon the dead. Yet this sacrifice was not in vain. The prolonged defense had prevented An Lushan's army from advancing south, giving the Tang dynasty precious time to reorganize and ultimately survive the rebellion. 3 days after Suyang fell, Tang reinforcements finally arrived and recaptured the city after 4 days of fierce fighting. The An Lushan rebellion would continue for 6 more years, ultimately claiming 36 million lives and weakening the Tang dynasty beyond recovery. But the empire survived, and China remained unified in large part because of the time purchased by Zhang Shun's impossible defense. The story of Suyang forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of loyalty, the nature of sacrifice, and the boundaries of civilized behavior when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Zhang Shun and his soldiers committed acts that horrify us across the centuries, yet they did so in service of principles they held more sacred than life itself. In the end, they saved their dynasty by consuming their city, purchasing survival through the systematic destruction of everything they had sworn to protect. This is what happens when ordinary people face impossible choices, when the mathematics of survival override every moral constraint, when loyalty demands the ultimate sacrifice not just of oneself, but of one's very humanity. The Siege of Suyang stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of how thin the line between heroism and horror truly is, and how quickly that line can disappear when civilization itself hangs in the balance.